The state fined me $15,000 for maintaining a dam that had been sitting on my property for over 50 years, and when I finally stopped taking care of it, exactly the way they told me to, the dam collapsed, the pond disappeared, and somehow the fine disappeared too. Even now, whenever I tell people this story, they usually stare at me for a second like they're waiting for the punchline, because it sounds less like real life and more like one of those stories you hear at a bar from a guy who's had 3 beers too many. But every word of it happened. My name is Ryan Calloway, and a few years ago, I bought 87 acres outside a small town called Blackstone Hollow, the kind of place where people wave at strangers, everybody knows who owns which truck, and local gossip travels faster than the internet. I wasn't looking for luxury when I bought the property. I wasn't trying to build some giant ranch or become a land developer. Honestly, I just wanted peace. After spending nearly 20 years working construction in cities that never seemed to slow down, I wanted a place where the loudest sound at night was wind moving through trees. The property checked every box I had. Rolling hills, open pasture, patches of hardwood forest, a narrow creek cutting across the backside of the land, and most importantly, a beautiful pond sitting right in the center of it all. The pond wasn't natural. It existed because decades earlier, long before I ever showed up, someone had built a small dam across the creek. It wasn't some giant concrete structure like you'd see on television. It was modest, mostly earth, rock, and old reinforcement work that had been added over the years. Nothing flashy, nothing that would catch anybody's attention. But it worked. The pond it created was beautiful. Early in the mornings, deer would come down to drink. Ducks nested along the shoreline. Herons stood motionless in the shallows waiting for fish. Some evenings I'd sit on a folding chair with a cup of coffee and watch the sunset reflect across the water until the entire pond looked like molten gold. The previous owner, an older man named Harold Benton, had cared for the place most of his life. His daughter handled the sale after he passed away, and during our first walkthrough she pointed toward the pond and smiled. That was Dad's favorite spot in the world. Looking back, I understand exactly why. There was something calming about it. Something that made the rest of the world feel very far away. After I bought the property, I quickly learned that the dam required occasional maintenance. Nothing major. Every spring after snowmelt, I'd walk the structure, check for erosion, clear sticks and branches from the spillway, patch weak spots, and make sure water could move safely through the system. It wasn't complicated engineering. It was basic landowner responsibility. The kind of work people have quietly done for generations. My neighbor, Walt Simmons, used to tease me about it. He'd drive past on his ATV and yell, "You spend more time with that dam than most folks spend with their families." I'd laugh and tell him, "Yeah, but if I ignore it, someday it'll become my most expensive problem." At the time I thought that was a joke. Turns out it became a prophecy. Everything stayed peaceful for nearly 6 years. Then one evening I attended a county landowners meeting at the community center. Normally I skipped those things because they were usually 3 hours of paperwork discussions disguised as public meetings, but a friend convinced me to go. About halfway through the meeting, a representative from a regional environmental agency stood up and started giving a presentation about water management compliance. Most people immediately checked out mentally. A few stared at their phones. Others looked like they were fighting sleep. The presentation was full of legal terminology, permit classifications, inspection procedures, regulatory frameworks, and enough bureaucratic language to make your eyes glaze over. I remember leaning toward my friend Mason and whispering, "If this presentation goes any longer, they're going to need paramedics for half the room." He nearly choked trying not to laugh. We forgot about it the second we walked out the door. At least I did. About a month later, 3 state vehicles rolled onto my property. I watched from the porch as several inspectors climbed out carrying clipboards, cameras, measuring equipment, and expressions serious enough to make me wonder if somebody had reported a crime. A woman named Denise Harper introduced herself and explained they were conducting assessments of private water control structures throughout the county. The whole thing sounded routine. I had nothing to hide, so I spent the next couple of hours answering questions. They walked along the dam. They measured elevations. They photographed the spillway. They asked who built it, how old it was, whether I generated electricity, whether I irrigated crops, whether I sold water rights. Every answer was simple. I didn't build it. It existed before I bought the property. No electricity, no irrigation business, no commercial operation, just a pond. When they finally left, I figured that was the end of it. In fact, I remember feeling slightly proud. The structure was in good condition. The pond looked healthy. Everything seemed fine. Then 34 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter waiting for me. I carried it into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and opened the envelope without giving it much thought. Less than a minute later, I was staring at the paper in complete disbelief. According to the state, I wasn't responsibly maintaining an old dam. I wasn't preserving a pond. I wasn't protecting wildlife habitat. According to them, I was illegally controlling a regulated water structure. And attached to that accusation was a $15,000 fine that made me read the letter 3 times because I honestly thought there had to be a typo somewhere. Unfortunately, there wasn't, and the deeper I read into the document, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake at all. It was only the beginning of a fight I never saw coming. The rest of the letter was somehow even worse than the fine itself. According to the state, the pond on my property was being created by a structure that influenced the natural flow of a waterway, which meant the dam now fell under a category of regulations I had never even heard of. They wanted engineering reviews, environmental assessments, structural certifications, permit applications, inspections, reports, and enough paperwork to fill the bed of a pickup truck. I called the number listed at the bottom of the letter that same afternoon, mostly because I was convinced somebody had mixed up my file with a hydroelectric company somewhere. After sitting on hold long enough to age visibly, I finally reached a woman who transferred me to another office, which transferred me to another office, which eventually landed me with a man named Randall Pierce. I still remember his voice because it carried that particular tone bureaucrats develop after spending years explaining absurd rules with complete confidence. I explained everything. The dam wasn't mine originally. I hadn't built it. I wasn't making money from it. I wasn't selling water. I wasn't generating electricity. I was just maintaining an old structure so it wouldn't fail. There was a pause. Then Randall said something that honestly changed the entire direction of the story. He said, "Mr. Mercer, if you are not the registered operator of the structure, you should not be conducting maintenance activities on it." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" He repeated it. "Unauthorized maintenance may be interpreted as operational control." For a second I thought he was joking. "So you're saying the reason you're fining me is because I've been keeping the dam safe?" Another pause. "I'm saying that maintaining a regulated structure without proper authorization creates compliance concerns." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "And if I stop maintaining it?" He cleared his throat. "That would be your decision as the property owner." The call ended a few minutes later, but his words stayed in my head for days. "That would be your decision as the property owner." I kept replaying that sentence while walking the property. Every time I reached the pond, I'd look across the water and think about how backwards the entire situation felt. The state wasn't offering help. They weren't taking responsibility. They weren't stepping in to maintain the structure themselves. They were simply punishing the one person who had been preventing it from deteriorating. A week later, I met Earl at the diner in town. He listened to the whole story while stirring his coffee. When I finished, he shook his head slowly. "Let me see if I got this right. They're mad because you've been taking care of it. Apparently. And they don't want you taking care of it. Apparently." Earl laughed so hard the waitress turned around to look at him. "Well, Caleb, sounds like they just solved their own problem." At first I thought he was kidding. Then I realized he wasn't. Spring arrived a few weeks later, and for the first time since buying the property, I didn't touch the dam. Normally I'd spend 2 weekends inspecting every section. That year I stayed home. Branches collected near the spillway. I left them there. Rain carved shallow grooves into the embankment. I left them alone. Small patches of erosion appeared along the downstream slope. I watched from a distance. Every instinct told me to fix them. Every habit I'd developed over years screamed at me to grab a shovel and get to work. But each time I thought about it, Randall's voice came back. "Unauthorized maintenance may be interpreted as operational control." Fine. If maintaining it was a problem, I would stop maintaining it. Through early summer the changes were subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed anything. But I noticed everything. Water lingered in places where drainage used to work properly. Roots expanded into weak sections. Debris narrowed the spillway opening. During one particularly heavy rainstorm, I stood on my porch watching water push against the old structure. My stomach tightened. Not because I thought disaster was coming immediately, but because I understood exactly how these things age. Neglect rarely causes dramatic failures overnight. It happens one small weakness at a time, one ignored crack, one season after another. By July, even my neighbor noticed. Earl pulled up one afternoon and pointed toward the dam. "You really aren't touching it, are you?" "Nope. Feels weird. Feels very weird." He nodded. Like watching somebody refuse to take their kid to the doctor because the insurance company told them not to. That comparison hit harder than he intended. Because the truth was, I cared about that pond. More than I probably should have. Over the years, it had become part of the property's identity. Deer drank there every morning. Ducks nested along the edge. Local kids occasionally stopped by with permission to fish. Some of my favorite memories involved sitting beside that water at sunset after a long day of work. Letting it deteriorate felt wrong, but being punished for protecting it felt worse. Then autumn arrived, and with it came rain. Lots of rain. The kind of steady storms that roll through for days and leave everything soaked. The creek swelled. Water levels climbed. Pressure built behind the aging embankment. One morning I walked down to inspect things from a distance and immediately noticed something different. The spillway had widened. Water was cutting around sections that had held for years. The pond level had dropped several inches. Nature had begun reclaiming the structure. I remember standing there in complete silence. Not angry, not happy, just strangely resigned. The process had started. A few weeks later, another storm system moved through the region. Weather reports warned of flash flooding. Roads closed in neighboring counties. Creeks overflowed their banks. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of rain hammering the roof. The wind rattled the windows. For some reason, I couldn't fall back asleep. So I sat in the dark living room drinking coffee and staring outside. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something. Not an explosion, not a crash. More like a deep, distant roar carried through the storm. I knew immediately what it was. The next morning, the rain finally eased. I pulled on my boots and headed toward the pond. Halfway there, I could already see the difference. The waterline was gone. The familiar reflection of trees had vanished. And when I reached the crest of the old embankment, I stopped walking. A section of the dam had failed during the night. The creek had punched straight through the weakened earth, carving a channel where the structure used to stand. Water rushed through the opening, racing downhill as if it had been waiting years for the opportunity. The pond was draining before my eyes. What had once been deep water was now exposed mud, wet grass, scattered stones, and the twisted remains of old roots. For a long moment, I just stood there listening. No anger, no triumph. Just the strange realization that an entire landscape I had known for years was disappearing in real time. And the most incredible part was that I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stepped aside and allowed nature to do exactly what nature always does when people stop holding it back. By the time winter arrived, the pond that had defined my property for years was gone. The transformation was almost surreal. Places where fish once swam were now stretches of wet grass and exposed stone. The old shoreline looked strangely oversized without water against it. Every time I walked out there, I felt a mixture of sadness and disbelief. I wasn't celebrating. Contrary to what some people later assumed, I hadn't spent months plotting revenge. I hadn't tried to destroy the dam. I hadn't hired anybody to remove it. I had simply followed the guidance I was given. If maintaining the structure made me an unauthorized operator, then I would no longer maintain it. Nature handled the rest. About 3 weeks after the collapse, I saw state vehicles pulling into my driveway again. This time there were only 2 of them. One of the inspectors was Denise Harper, the same woman who had visited during the original inspection. We exchanged polite greetings before walking toward what remained of the dam. The entire atmosphere felt different. During the first inspection, everyone carried themselves with the confidence of people evaluating a regulated structure. Now they looked more like investigators arriving after a mystery had already solved itself. We stood overlooking the channel where water now flowed freely through the gap. Denise reviewed photographs, took notes, and occasionally compared the scene to documents on her clipboard. Finally, she lowered the paperwork and simply stared at the creek for several seconds. "Well," she said quietly, "that's certainly changed." I couldn't help myself. "Looks pretty natural to me." She glanced at me, knowing exactly what I meant. Neither of us said anything else. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. I remember carrying it into the house with absolutely no expectations. At that point, I was exhausted by the entire situation. I opened the envelope at the same kitchen table where all of this had started. This letter was much shorter. According to the agency's latest findings, there was no longer a regulated dam structure present on the property. The creek had returned to a natural flow path. The waterway no longer fell under the compliance category that had triggered the original enforcement action. Therefore, the fine was being withdrawn. I read that paragraph 3 times, then laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. For over a year, I had been told the structure required regulation because it existed. I had been fined because I was maintaining it. I had been warned that my actions constituted unauthorized control. Then, once the structure disappeared because nobody was maintaining it anymore, the problem disappeared too. It was one of the most perfectly circular pieces of logic I'd ever encountered. Earl stopped by later that afternoon. I handed him the letter without saying a word. He read it, shook his head, and started laughing. "So let me get this straight," he said. "When there was a dam, you got fined. When there wasn't a dam, the fine vanished." Apparently. Ryan, that's the most government thing I've ever heard. We stood there laughing, but underneath the humor was something more complicated. Because despite everything, I still missed the pond. I missed the ducks. I missed the evening reflections on the water. I missed the feeling of sitting beside it after a long day. The state may have removed the penalty, but nobody gave me back what had been lost. Then again, maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes bureaucracy becomes so focused on assigning responsibility that it forgets why responsible people were helping in the first place. Sometimes regulations designed to protect something end up discouraging the very people who have been protecting it for years. And sometimes the unintended consequences become impossible to ignore until they're sitting right in front of everyone. Today, if you visit that section of the property, you'd never know a pond existed there. The creek winds naturally through a grassy meadow. Wildflowers grow where water once stood. Deer still visit. Birds still gather. Nature adapted faster than any of us expected. In some ways it's beautiful, just different. Every now and then somebody hears the story and asks whether I regret letting the dam go. That's a difficult question. Part of me absolutely does. Another part of me still wonders what alternative I realistically had. Keep maintaining it and risk even bigger penalties? Spend tens of thousands on engineering studies for a pond that generated no income? Fight a bureaucracy with deeper pockets than mine? I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. The dam survived for decades because ordinary people quietly cared for it. The moment caring became a liability, its future was already decided. And that's why I want to hear from you. Was I wrong for stepping back and letting nature take its course? Should I have continued fighting to save the pond no matter the cost? Or does the responsibility belong to the system that punished the one person keeping it alive? Let me know what you think in the comments, because even now, years later, people still argue about who was right, who was wrong, and whether common sense ever had a chance in this situation at all.